modern marvels.
The explosion ripped through the mezzanine floor, which houses the executive suites where the bomb was discovered early yesterday morning.
The FBI continued to keep this area around Kaczynski's cabin cordoned off from the press. They refused to deny or confirm reports that there was an explosion in this area earlier this morning.
The elderly woman who opened the mailbox told her husband that the bomb looked like a flashlight. It blew up when she touched it.
Each of these stories is a little different, yet each shares one thing in common. The victims never saw it coming. A booby trap is an explosive or mechanical trap that is designed to appear totally innocent. But when it's moved or touched by an unwary person, it suddenly goes off.
Anything at all can be booby-trapped, or booby traps can be fabricated from just about anything that you can get your hands on.
Dynamite wired to a car's ignition. As the key is turned, it ignites. A shotgun hooked up to a doorknob. When the door opens, it goes off. Even a water faucet, rigged so when it's turned on, an entire house explodes.
Bottom line is, a lot of bad people out there with very vivid imagination.
Most booby traps are meant to kill or seriously injure their intended victims. Others are designed to harass and intimidate. But whatever their purpose, they're showing up more and more, not only on faraway battlefields, but on our streets and in our workplaces, even in our homes.
The motives are almost endless: revenge, love triangles, property protection, homicide, extortion, drug dealing, you name it, it runs the gamut.
According to the latest figures from the FBI and the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, there's been a record number of bombings or attempted bombings recorded in the United States since 1993. That number exceeded 8,000. 10 to 15% were directly related to booby trap incidents. That number is expected to increase.
I believe the use of booby traps in the future is going to continue to climb. There are so many ways that you can devise a booby trap around technology.
The fact that there is such easy access to information detailing the ins and outs of booby trap construction isn't helping.
There's a lot of publications and manuals out there put out by various government agencies as well as clandestine type publications that give that type of information. But without a doubt, the internet is probably one of the largest information sources we see when people are experimenting or making explosive devices, kids especially.
In the make-believe world of video games and action movies, booby traps are edge-of-the-seat thrillers. Audiences are delighted with the unique devices set up to protect the mummified remains of an Egyptian pharaoh and the rich treasures hidden alongside his corpse. In reality, the ancient Egyptians used booby traps sparingly. The pharaoh's builders camouflaged the entrances to their tombs with rocks and debris and carved curses into the entrances and on the walls inside the tomb.
They would do things like have a meandering pattern for the corridors. Sometimes some of them would end in false chambers. Some of them would be dead ends. Some of them would double back. Some of these corridors were blocked with huge stones that slid into place when the tomb was sealed.
But for a select number of tombs, ancient engineers employed several ingenious devices to send a crystal clear message to the would-be grave robber.
One of the obvious ways of making a booby trap would be to have rocks fall on someone. And even though the Egyptians didn't do that very often, we do have a couple of examples of it occurring.
A popular trap was the man-burying booby trap. A large funnel was hollowed out in the ceiling of the corridor that led to the burial chamber. The funnel was then filled with rocks and sand. A large blocking stone was then rolled in under the shaft. A robber trying to dig around the blocking stone would trigger the sticks holding the funnel together, collapsing the entire thing and burying the thief alive.
In the tomb that we were working on a few years ago, we ran across exactly the same thing, and the remnants of that funnel actually did come down at one point, and we had to evacuate the tomb very, very quickly.
Tomb builders also like digging bottomless pits hidden under camouflaged covers. A single careless step would send unsuspecting intruders plummeting through a false floor and into a dark abyss.
The deeper ones of these, of course, they would never be able to scale their way out of.
There's some evidence that suggests poisonous powders were spread across the burial chamber's floor. When an intruder entered, the powders were released into the air and inhaled. In fact, a poisonous substance was unleashed in a tomb in Egypt's Valley of the Golden Mummies in September 2000, as archaeologist Zahi Hawass and his team entered the main burial chamber. Without realizing it, they stepped into a 2-foot layer of yellow powder, sending it airborne. The team became ill almost instantly and was forced to evacuate. 20 workers wearing gas masks labored for 2 weeks to remove the mysterious substance, later identified as tainted iron oxide. But was it a booby trap?
The only question, of course, is whether this material was put there by the Egyptians. There is indication that in some of the tombs there is lethal bacteria and molds that have come on the walls. Aspergillus is one of them that has been recognized.
Over 4,000 miles east of Egypt's Valley of the Golden Mummies lay the ruins of one of the greatest discoveries of all time. It is here that archaeologists struggle with a far more deadly puzzle. 100,000 slaves toiled for 36 years to build the mausoleum of the Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang. It covered 10 square miles and was buried 15 stories underground. For 2 millennia, an army of 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers and horses kept watch over his complex burial site. According to folklore, scores of booby traps wait in silence as well.
By popular myth and legend, the tomb is protected by an elaborate system of crossbows and other weapons waiting to be discharged at any potential grave robber. There are also supposed to be large ponds or even rivers of mercury placed inside the tomb for its noxious fumes, which would theoretically overcome any intruder.
Today, most of the site has yet to be excavated. One of the reasons is that Chinese archaeologists and their workers believe that crossbows do exist. They are proceeding slowly with great caution, so as not to become modern victims of the Chinese emperor's ancient booby traps. Early engineers had managed to turn the art of protecting burial grounds and tombs into a deadly science. But it would take ancient armies and military geniuses to transform booby traps from guardians of the dead to weapons of war.
The term booby trap originated in the mid-1800s and defined a type of practical joke. It required a gullible victim, the booby, who could be fooled into getting caught in some kind of comical trap. Booby traps will continue on Modern Marvels.
It was on the battlefields of North Africa, Greece, and the ancient Near East that military geniuses like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar first discovered the tactical significance of booby traps. By setting up hidden snares and traps, they realized they could injure or kill unsuspecting enemies without exposing their own troops to danger. Early on, commanders favored camouflaged pits, deep enough to hold razor-sharp spears, angled to impale the foe.
The other thing was a cauldron, which was a sharpened triangular piece of metal that could be thrown out in front so that the enemy would run over it with their horses, but it could also be used as an anti-infantry weapon.
Julius Caesar used caltrops during the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC. As his legions seemed headed for defeat, Caesar ordered hundreds of caltrops to be strategically positioned on the ground in front of his defenses. As wave after wave of the Gallic cavalry charged his line, his hidden booby traps tore at the hooves of the attacking army's horses, slowing down their assault. Military historians believe it was this strategy that helped Julius Caesar to turn a losing battle into a victory. Not surprisingly, today there is a modern version of the ancient caltrop. The road spikes used by police officers in pursuit of a suspect fleeing in a vehicle.
The spikes are made in a certain way that they'll always be upright, and when the bad guy runs over it and flattens all four tires and hopefully stops the pursuit.
The invention of gunpowder in Asia during the 12th century vastly increased the potential for carnage on the battlefield. As a result, gunpowder soon became a staple ingredient in the manufacture of booby traps. In Europe during the Middle Ages, warring kings and landowners protected the length and breadth of their estates' boundaries by laying tripwires connected to containers packed with explosives, nails, and broken glass. During the American Civil War, it was soldiers on both sides who took booby trapping to a new level of sophistication.
We have a pistol barrel, a lockwork off of a regular percussion-type weapon system, and a trigger. And as the triggering mechanism is disturbed, the safety bar would fall free, the locking mechanism would trip forward, and bang, they have their man.
They connected their devices to everyday objects like a spoon or a jackknife. The items were left behind when they moved out of the area. The booby traps were literally hidden in plain sight. When the enemy entered the abandoned camp and picked up the harmless-looking spoon or knife, the booby trap would detonate. By the time World War I began in 1914, the machine gun and artillery were the dominant weapons on the battlefield. The use of this hardware made free movement impossible. So both sides adopted trench warfare. But as the American, French, and British forces attempted to storm the German trenches, they found that yet another deadly weapon awaited them.
The Germans got very good at booby-trapping devices like tripwires across the entrances of dugouts, so that if you entered a dugout, you'd hit the tripwire, it would explode. They also got very good at booby-trapping a helmet or a Luger pistol because everybody wants a souvenir. So these things were rigged in such a way that if you move them, they would explode.
During World War II, the art and science of the military booby trap exploded, literally and figuratively. There is a combination of ways that a booby trap can be triggered.
One way is pressure, and then any pressure on this would crush the exploder and it would go off. You could also rig this up as a tripwire so that when you pull this, it would go off. You could make this also a tension release device so that if you cut the wire, it would also go off.
German soldiers planted booby traps along roads and in fields to catch the unsuspecting or the inquisitive. Allied soldiers landing on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day met anti-tank barriers that were rigged to explode if moved. As the Allies pushed farther inland, they found that the Germans had laid tripwires attached to explosives across doorways and staircases, or attached to doors, cupboards, and windows.
Soldiers don't go through doors, they go through the windows. And you would smash a window in with your rifle butt. And when you smashed it, it would set the explosive off.
In late 1944, during their drive across northwestern Europe, Allied forces came across an abandoned German headquarters. No mines or booby traps were found, but when a soldier urinated against the building wall, an electrical connection made by the urine set off a booby trap that destroyed that building. The Japanese planted a substantial number of booby traps against the Allies, using them in the jungles, along beaches, anywhere they figured they could fool an unsuspecting or curious GI. They often booby-trapped desirable objects such as food and sake, or war souvenirs like rifles and helmets. Desperate to get in the last punch, they even booby-trapped the bodies of their own dead or wounded soldiers.
You did not want to disturb a Japanese body in World War II. There was the pressure release device where if you moved the body, the pressure would be released and an explosive device would go off.
But the use of booby traps on the American side was limited. Amazingly, it took permission from a 3-star general for an American soldier to set up a trap. During the Indochina Wars, it was the Viet Cong who were unmatched for ingenuity and deadly effectiveness with booby traps. They improvised mines out of any explosives they could find, packing them into seemingly harmless objects. Fruit hanging from a tree, a pile of buffalo dung, even an empty ginger jar.
When I was in Vietnam, the most common booby trap that we ran into was nothing more than a tin can with a hand grenade stuck in there with a tripwire across the trail. You'd come along, you'd trip the wire, you'd pull the hand grenade out of the tin can, and it would explode.
A centuries-old favorite of the Viet Cong was the punji pit. Various sized pits were dug. Sharpened bamboo was then planted upward at the bottom of the pit. Most were just large enough to impale a victim's foot. A few were big enough to swallow a man. Another ingeniously arranged trap was the bamboo whip. A green bamboo pole with spikes attached to an end was pulled back and held by a catch device. When the tripwire stretched across the trail was triggered, the whip would snap back, impaling whoever set it off. In the 1990s, during the civil wars throughout Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo, the Serbs made extensive use of indiscriminate mine-laying and booby-trapping. Their intention was to terrorize and thereby control the civilian population. Booby-trapped mines were placed in residential rubble to prevent anyone from rebuilding a house. The booby traps were rigged to everyday objects in and around houses and farms. Doors, light switches, even televisions.
Grenades were typically employed as booby traps. They would remove the pin and the safety from a hand grenade, and they would slip it into a glass or a jar, something that would hold the spoon in place. And then they would place it very precariously on a door handle. When you would have someone walk into a room and they would turn the door handle, the glass would fall and break, and then the grenade detonates as the person is walking into the room.
One very complex booby trap consisted of a pile of explosives hidden in the attic of a house, then linked by an elaborate wiring system to the kitchen faucet. Anyone who turned on the tap for a drink of water would close the electric circuit, setting off a fatal explosion. But soon, booby trapping would reach a whole new level of destruction, turning an entire town into a single, massive trap.
Approximately 10% of the American casualties in Vietnam were caused by booby traps. Among those injured was Captain Colin Powell, who later became Secretary of State. Booby Trap will continue on Modern Marvels.
It was dawn when the Israeli army entered the Palestinian town of Jenin and the nearby refugee camp in March 2002. What they found shocked them. More booby traps per square inch than had ever been discovered in one location. Some of the booby-trapped bombs were huge, containing as much as 250 pounds of explosives. Compare this with a typical suicide bomber, whose explosive content is a mere 25 pounds. Israeli bulldozers rolled along the principal roads leading into Jenin, clearing booby traps along the way. In one 3/4-mile stretch of road, 124 separate booby traps were found and detonated. In the refugee camp, The explosive charges were even more densely packed. Over 3 days, 23 Israeli soldiers and 52 Palestinians were killed, many by rubble from the exploding booby traps and mines with which Palestinian fighters had honeycombed the camp. Some of the bombs they found were landmines. Others were landmines made into booby traps.
Improvising a mine for the explosive content is really good because you have a large explosive ready to go right there.
The mechanical differences between booby traps and landmines are few. Both use the same type of firing devices and explosive-laden containers. The differences are in their purpose. Landmines are designed to be positioned solely in the ground. In this way, they serve their primary purpose, to slow down an enemy's advance. A booby trap, however, can be anywhere. And it is usually disguised to look like an innocent object. Even as a soldier successfully scans the ground for landmines, the possibility of detonating a booby trap exists everywhere, all around him. It is a constant, relentless, unforgiving threat. In this way, the booby trap serves its purpose: to create doubt by amping up the stress level.
The booby trap makes its money on catching the enemy unaware. It really has that psychological impact on his morale.
The fact that booby traps are so hard to detect makes them a truly sinister tool of destruction and terror. American forces in Afghanistan were in constant danger of detonating booby traps. Most Al-Qaeda caves or weapons cache sites were loaded with them. When a soldier or a Marine did find a booby trap, his standing order was to let the Explosive Ordnance Disposal, or EOD, personnel deal with it.
The reason the EOD people went in to try to take care of that was there was a possibility that there were also documents in there, anything that could be used as evidence and possible indicators as to what Al-Qaeda might do then and in the future.
Once a cave had been cleared, it was demolished.
Today we're going to talk about some mines that can be booby trapped, manufactured in Yugoslavia.
This group is currently being trained to detect a variety of the latest booby traps.
This mine, made in
Those manufactured by the military,
found in Bosnia,
and those that are improvised by terrorists and guerrillas.
The way it's used as a booby trap, this is going to be a tripwire or pressure function.
We teach Marines that there exists the possibility that every obstacle is booby trapped.
Sergeant Osmore, go hand me that mine. It's that easy. Go home in a plastic bag. Notice I didn't say a body bag, a plastic bag. That's all that's going to be left.
How they handle a booby trap depends largely upon how much damage they can accept in the vicinity of the trap.
If damage is unacceptable, for example, if you're working in the building, mark the booby trap and request some assistance from explosive ordnance disposal personnel or some combat engineers. If you can accept a certain degree of damage to the area that you're operating in, the preferred method is to detonate the booby trap in place.
To help ensure their safety, the Marine EOD personnel often rely on tools, like this remotely controlled robot called Andros.
We can use it to recon the suspect item, and if it is a bomb or booby trap, we can use this device also to disarm or disrupt or even x-ray or move the device. Got 3 different video cameras on board. This is my forward-looking camera, and this is a side view camera. It has pan, tilt, and zoom features in it. This is my bottom view camera. It's got all the basic features of a regular arm. It's got a shoulder, a wrist, an elbow. It's got a gripper that acts like a hand. I can open and close the gripper. The wrist turns 360 degrees. As long as I can reach it, which usually is about 7 feet, I can do anything I want with it.
But remote control robots like Andros were not available to military EOD during the war in Somalia in 1993. Disarming the improvised booby traps had to be done carefully, the old-fashioned way.
In Somalia, we encountered booby traps almost on a daily basis. They would use very simple booby traps, things like hand grenades under rocks, hand grenades wedged between doorways.
Somalian warlords and their hired thugs seldom used booby traps in a military sense. They did use them to terrorize and then to extort money from their own countrymen.
There were 2 or 3 well stations in the city. People would take a landmine, put a hand grenade underneath of it, and they'd make it readily obvious that you could see it.
The warlords created visible booby trap mazes around the wells, then stood with their guns poised and their open hands outstretched, ready to take payment for leading thirsty Somalis safely through the maze to the well.
We would work on a daily basis to go out and clear some of these booby-trapped items.
Extortion isn't the only motive for the bad guys setting booby traps. Some of the most famous mad bombers were just that, madmen.
Around the world, someone is killed or injured by a booby trap, landmine, or other similar explosive device every 22 minutes. Booby traps will continue on Modern Marvels.
New York City in the mid-20th century. World famous for its fast pace, sophistication, and glamour. But lurking just beneath the surface, there was a feeling of uneasiness. For 16 years, an anonymous crackpot secretly planted booby traps in public places. New Yorkers nervously referred to him as the Mad Bomber. He planted 32 bombs in all, from 1940 until 1956. One was attached to a seat in a movie theater. 22 people were wounded, many critically. The bomber's anger appeared to be directed at the city's power company, to which he sent a letter that read, "I can make the Con Edison sorry."
When we look at profiles of bombers, normally we're looking at someone who is angry, but it's also someone who is focused. The bomb itself gives him an outlet for his anger, for his frustration, and it gives him the ability to strike out at society.
The serial bomber turned out to be a polite, well-dressed, but delusional fellow by the name of George Metesky. Metesky built his booby traps in the garage of the apartment he shared with his 2 unmarried sisters in Waterbury, Connecticut. His bombs were handmade, out of corrugated pipe, gunpowder, and a trigger mechanism. Ted Kaczynski, the man known as the Unabomber, may have been inspired by New York's Mad Bomber.
On some level, he was probably impacted by Metesky and other bombers and developed his deadly activities along the same lines that had happened nearly half a century before.
Kaczynski had a gripe against anyone he believed was corrupting the environment with modern technology. Among his targets were airlines, universities, and manufacturers.
This was a case that ran approximately 18 years with a series of bombings all across the United States.
Kaczynski was able to stay one step ahead of his relentless pursuers because, like George Metesky, his booby traps also were handmade. In an isolated cabin in Montana with no electricity, Kaczynski carefully crafted his bomb parts from pieces of mahogany and other hardwoods used in furniture. One bomb contained a twig from a cherry tree.
Even the screws that were used to put it together, he had crafted from hand. They were a labor of absolute love for him.
3 people who opened Kaczynski's plain-wrapped homemade wooden boxes were killed. Another 23 were wounded.
Did you do it?
The victims of the most recent serial bomber were ordinary citizens living the quiet life in America's heartland. Their terror lasted for 1 week in May 2002.
The scare started on Friday when 8 pipe bombs were found in Illinois and eastern Iowa. The FBI says 6 people were hurt by those bombs, including 4 postal workers.
You'd think out here in the rural Nebraska, it's not going to happen.
Why they picked our road, why, I have no idea.
One more time, it appeared to be random bombings without purpose, and the authorities were forced to consider anything from members of militia groups to international terrorists to high school kids with bombs.
A nationwide manhunt resulted in the arrest of Luke Helder, a 21-year-old industrial design student. He said he planted booby traps because he didn't like the way the government created laws that he felt manipulated lives. Buying the parts to put his booby traps together was easy.
Luke Helder, like so many other makers of booby traps, was able to purchase all of the components for his deadly devices simply by going to local stores and purchasing over the counter the supplies, the equipment that he needed. There was no license, there was no identity check.
He told authorities the placement of the bombs in mailboxes across the country was to create a smiley face on the U.S. map. Reports of booby traps killing or injuring victims has increased 60% over the past decade. Surprisingly, most were guarding pot farms or meth labs from thieves and police. Many marijuana farms, especially in the western U.S., rely on well-placed booby traps for protection.
One of the most common and more deadly booby traps that we find around marijuana patches is the shotgun-type trap. It's made out of a common rat trap, wood, and 3/4 inch diameter plumbing pipe. What the booby trapper does is insert a shotgun shell into the plumbing pipe, finds a suitable support like a stump, attaches the wood to the stump, brings the bail around. The unsuspecting officer comes down the trail, hits the wire, causes the pin to slip out, and it fires the device.
Less deadly but exceptionally painful. Are booby traps designed to harass law enforcement or intimidate thieves wanting to steal the marijuana plants?
One thing we'll typically see is either single or double-edged razor blades, which are placed down in the stalk of a marijuana plant. It deters people from just reaching in and grabbing the plant and pulling it out because they're going to get cut if they don't know it's there.
There's another painful, non-lethal trap out there that tears at the face.
It's just a simple fish hook with fishing line attached to it. You can see it's very, very sharp on the end and has barbs. Where we'll typically find these is hanging on small branches. When you walk through here, they're going to either snag in your eye, in your cheek, your scalp, or somewhere along in your head area. And with the barbs on them, they're not going to come out very easily.
Meth labs rigged with booby traps present another deadly challenge. More than 18 law enforcement officers were killed and hundreds of others wounded in recent years attempting to enter and close down these illicit operations.
We have found shotgun booby traps behind doors where you open the door and it fires a shotgun. They're also finding a lot of chemical type booby traps, probably not going to kill them, but could seriously injure them and cause potential long-term damage.
Not all booby traps are meant to kill or injure. Some are to provide early warning.
A very simple device. It's nothing more than a tripwire, empty can, a handful of pebbles. Pebbles go in the can. Officer comes down a trail. They'll disturb the wire, causes a rattling sound, gives the pot farmers down the road an opportunity to get away.
Experts agree that the chances are slim for the average citizen to be caught by a booby trap. But these same experts caution that it is possible, especially for hikers or bicyclists who innocently wander into a marijuana field on public lands.
If you're in a national forest, if you're in a state park, there's the possibility that you could stumble onto an illegal marijuana grow that is booby trapped with either lethal or non-lethal means, or both.
One very famous booby trap case involved a gambling casino in a small Nevada town called State Line. The year was 1981.
They made this big bomb, they put it in the Harvey's casino. They said, you give us some money and we'll tell you how to take it apart. Classic extortion bombing.
The extortionists had built 25 tamper-proof booby trap devices inside a refrigerator bomb. Authorities decided it would be safer to destroy the 1,100-pound bomb in place rather than risk trying to disarm it. There is another disturbing development in the use of booby traps. Otherwise law-abiding citizens are using them to take the law into their own hands.
We see private citizens, store owners, setting up their own form of booby traps to protect themselves, their property. So when the burglar breaks into the back of a store at night again, that shotgun is there to face him. Of course, that's illegal.
A classic case occurred in 1990 in Denver, Colorado. A warehouse owner, tired of frequent break-ins, rigged a 12-gauge shotgun booby trap to a window. When a teenage burglar was killed, the businessman was tried and convicted of manslaughter.
I was just pushed too far. They were stealing my life. It was like a war. I mean, it was my survival that I was trying to protect.
And then, the booby trap maker lost a wrongful death lawsuit brought by the dead thief's family.
According to the ATF, among the 4,000 booby traps and bombs found in the United States from 1993 to 1997, 84 were in vending machines and 86 in telephone booths. Booby traps will return on Modern Marvels.
On April 23, 1978, mobster Salvador Gingillo, better known as Sammy G, got into his car outside a cafe in Rochester, New York, and turned on the key. The car blew sky high, killing Sammy and seriously injuring his two bodyguards. Then FBI agent Clint Van Zandt was called to the scene.
The drunks, the winos, the pimps, the prostitutes that had been standing around watching ran over and started picking up the pieces of metal, the shards of glass. They all wanted a souvenir of the demise of Sammy G.
Gangsters have been booby-trapping the cars of the competition with bombs ever since crime became an organized business. But an alarming number of public officials and corporate executives in the U.S. and abroad have found they, too, are targets for car bombs. The increased demand for corporate security has spawned a new industry, the under-vehicle booby-trap detector. Because the designs are proprietary, no pictures of the devices are available. Basically, it works like this. If a bomb is attached to the car's frame with magnets, the detector will sense it immediately. Ever since the anthrax mail scare in 2001, even ordinary citizens are becoming fearful of this new brand of booby trap.
The portable letter bomb detector detects known agencies of bomb-making material like Syntex, C4, ammonium nitrate, TNT. The device allows the user to pass unopened mail across the target zone where the crosshairs are. If the letter is laced with any explosive material, the device will go off.
Not all booby traps are deadly, but there are some out there that cause a lot of suffering. Computer viruses. These treacherous cyber thugs qualify as booby traps. They engage an unsuspecting victim with an invitation to open seemingly harmless email. The result of following their simple instructions could ultimately lead to the destruction of irreplaceable data. In 1985, there were 11 known viruses. Today, there are over 60,000. The success of these cyber traps is often based on the public's desire for freebies.
Computer booby traps are something which lure a user into a false sense of security with the promise of some sort of reward, and at the end ends up tricking them in some way and giving them something unexpected.
That unexpected surprise is often a virus.
They end up triggering a mechanism which usually causes some sort of damage or further propagates the virus.
The lure of the freebie has produced a multi-million-dollar antivirus industry. The question is, do these antivirus programs really work?
There are probably 30 to 100 new viruses every month. So you can sort of do the math, figure 1 to 3 a day. So if you're updating every day, you seriously cut down the risk that you're going to be infected with a virus. And I say cut down, something new is going to hit your system, and until we figure out a way that doesn't rely on catching up with the viruses as they're written, we're always going to be one step behind.
While we may be a step behind computer viruses, software designers are staying a step ahead of software thieves.
Probably the most interesting example of this is the latest incarnation of the Windows operating system, Windows XP, which actually needs an activation code which is checked periodically back at Microsoft. If too many things on the system are changed, or if the operating system is installed on a second computer, the computers back at Redmond will figure that out, and the booby trap will be triggered, and the system will stop working.
Microsoft's new high-tech way to stop software piracy. But when it comes to disarming or just coping with booby traps, the military may be ahead of the computer whizzes, at least in a war zone. The right tool for the booby trap bombs found on the battlefields may be the TRCs, Tactical Remote Control Vehicles. They have many jobs, but in the hands of a bomb expert, they are particularly effective in defusing booby traps. The TRCs, called packbots, established that value in test after test. Looking like miniature tanks, stripped of their guns, the packbots moved with agility and navigated in the tightest of spots. Their onboard video cameras and audio sensors provided the precise and careful remote movement for safely rendering booby traps useless.
I think in the next 10 years, you're going to see the technology probably overtake us from where we are today in ways that we can't imagine as bomb techs being able to deal with explosive devices.
Perhaps the simplest and most intriguing future technology involves the U.S. government's experiments with honeybees. Researchers at the Pentagon have taught whole hives to ignore the scent of flowers and instead trained them to swarm on traces of explosives. Others might say the future of detecting booby traps has gone to the dogs.
Because of 9/11, there has been a great demand for an increase in the number of explosive detection dogs trained throughout the United States. We've been tasked here at ATF to train more canines, and so have all the other law enforcement agencies across the United States.
The ATF Canine School has trained 300 dogs since 1990. They work in embassies and airports in 13 countries overseas. Another 70 ATF dogs work domestically. ATF dogs learn how to distinguish the smell of explosives from other odors that are similar, like oil, gasoline, and antifreeze. Here, a dog is being trained to separate the smell of engine grease from explosives.
Good boy. And when they get a whiff of it, they'll sit down and alert their handler that there's a device there.
If a package has already been determined to be a possible booby trap, dogs are not used.
That doesn't put the dog or the handler or anybody else in danger.
Of course, most of the booby trap detection devices being researched and tested today are years away from making it to the field. Until then, the grunt trudging through the battlefield and the cop investigating the meth lab must continue to be suspicious of what he touches or where he steps.
The best advice I can give is to use your gut instinct. If you think something's wrong, it probably is. If you think you've encountered a booby trap, you probably have. Call for professional help and let us take the risk. That's what we get paid to do.
Thank you for watching The Amazing TV. Don't forget to subscribe.